Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the strange, the mundane, and the quietly absurd corners of history, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that toe the line between soothing and surreal. Tonight, we drift into the first chapter of a story about arrows, honor, and the peculiar shame of missing absolutely everything. Chapter 1. The Call to Arms. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, which was unfortunate because Tuesdays were when Tomlin did his mending. The letter bore the king's seal, a clumsy lump of wax pressed by someone who had clearly been in a hurry, and it demanded his presence in the Royal Archery Corps for the Battle of Blackmire Fen. Tomlin read it 3 times, his fingers leaving sweaty smudges on the parchment. It was an honor, of course. The king didn't just pluck any bowman from his village to join the ranks. But Tomlin had never shot at anything more threatening than a straw target, or the occasional squirrel that got too bold with his vegetable patch. The village square erupted in celebration when the news spread. Old man Hargrove clapped him on the back so hard Tomlin coughed up the cider he'd been nervously sipping. The baker's daughter, who had never so much as glanced at him before, suddenly found him fascinating enough to offer a loaf of bread for the road. Even the stray dogs seemed to look at him with something resembling respect. Tomlin smiled, nodded, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that he was terrible under pressure. The journey to the capital was a blur of bad roads and worse company. The king's courier, a man with the patience of a startled badger, herded Tomlin and a dozen other conscripted archers along like sheep bound for shearing. They slept in ditches, ate questionable stew, and listened to the courier's increasingly dramatic retellings of past battles. By the time they reached the royal camp, Tomlin was half convinced the enemy could be defeated by sheer force of the courier's storytelling alone. The camp itself was a sprawling, stinking mess of mud tents, and men who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. Tomlin was given a bow, nicer than his own, but stiff and unfamiliar, and a quiver of arrows that someone had fletched with what looked like chicken feathers. He was assigned to the third flank, a group of archers whose primary role, as far as he could tell, was to stand very still and try not to be noticed by the enemy. Their captain, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, inspected them with the enthusiasm of someone checking the bottom of his boot for dog mess. "You'll shoot when you're told to shoot," the captain barked. "You'll not shoot when you're not told to shoot. And if you piss yourselves, do it quietly." Tomlin nodded along, his stomach churning. The other archers seemed to take this all in stride, swapping jokes and sharpening their arrows with the ease of men who had done this before. Tomlin, meanwhile, was mentally rehearsing the steps of drawing a bow without accidentally shooting himself in the foot. That night, as the campfires flickered and the sounds of drunken singing drifted through the air, Tomlin lay awake in his tent. The dread that had been quietly gnawing at him since the summons now sat squarely on his chest, heavy as a sack of grain. He had always been a decent shot when there was no one watching. But battles, he suspected, were very much about being watched. By the enemy, by your fellow soldiers, by the king, who had apparently staked part of his strategy on Tomlin's ability to hit something. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Tomlin closed his eyes and tried to convince himself that tomorrow would be fine. After all, how hard could it be to loose an arrow into a mass of moving targets? The odds were technically in his favor. He was wrong, of course, but that revelation would come later. For now, there was only the quiet of the camp, the weight of the unfamiliar bow beside him, and the slow, creeping certainty that he was about to embarrass himself on a scale previously unimaginable. Chapter 2. The March to the Front. The army moved at the speed of a man who had just remembered he left his oven on. Slow, deliberate, and with an undercurrent of quiet panic. Tomlin had imagined war would be a swift and thunderous thing, full of galloping horses and shouted orders, but the reality was mostly shuffling. Endless, muddy shuffling. The third flank trudged along in the middle of the column, flanked by men who had apparently been born knowing how to march in perfect unison. Tomlin, meanwhile, kept stumbling over his own feet, his borrowed boots 2 sizes too big and slick with dew. Every time he lurched to the side, the archer next to him, a grizzled veteran named Rolf with a nose like a misplaced potato, would grunt in disapproval. Rolf was the sort of man who believed in the educational power of unsolicited advice. "You hold that bow like it's a live ferret," he observed, nodding at Tomlin's white-knuckled grip. "You ever shot anything that wasn't a hay bale?" Tomlin considered lying. But Rolf had the look of a man who could smell fear, so instead he muttered, "Squirrels." Rolf barked a laugh that sent a nearby sparrow fleeing for its life. "Squirrels, God save us." He clapped Tomlin on the shoulder hard enough to make his teeth rattle. "Well, lad, today you graduate to men, or if you're unlucky, to corpses." This did not help Tomlin's nerves. As they marched, the other archers filled the air with tales of past battles, each one more improbable than the last. There was the time Jorik had single-handedly held off 12 enemy swordsmen with nothing but a broken arrow and a particularly offensive limmer. The day Bren's bowstring snapped mid-battle, so he just threw his arrows like javelins and still took down 3 men. And of course, the legendary shot by old Tam, who once felled an enemy commander from 300 paces while blindfolded, drunk, and suffering from a rather aggressive case of gout. Tomlin listened, his own silence growing heavier with each story. He had no grand exploits, no impossible shots, just the memory of that one time he'd accidentally shot his neighbor's prize pumpkin, and spent the next week pretending it had been a particularly ambitious woodpecker. The landscape around them shifted from open fields to dense, mist-laden forests, the trees pressing in like silent spectators. The air smelled of damp earth, and the faint, metallic tang of armor that had seen too much rain. Every rustle of leaves made Tomlin's fingers twitch toward his quiver. At midday, the column halted near a shallow stream. The men collapsed where they stood, groaning as they peeled off boots to inspect blisters the size of coins. Tomlin sat on a mossy rock, chewing a strip of salted beef that tasted vaguely of despair, when the captain wandered over. "You look like a man waiting for his own hanging," the captain remarked, scratching his chin. Tomlin swallowed. "Just contemplating the battle, sir." The captain snorted. "Don't. Thinking's worse than the fighting. You start thinking, you remember you're mortal." Next thing you know, you're frozen like a rabbit in a snare. He squinted at Tomlin. "You ever seen battle?" "No, sir." "Good. First time's always the worst. After that you either get used to it or you die. Either way, problem solved." He gave Tomlin a pat on the back that felt more like a shove and ambled off to yell at someone else. Tomlin stared into the stream, watching the water twist around the rocks. He wondered, idly, if he could fake an injury. Not a serious one, just enough to be sent to the rear. A sprained ankle, maybe, or a sudden and entirely believable bout of swamp fever. But then the horns blew, low and mournful, and the column lurched back into motion. The battlefield was close now. Tomlin could feel it in the way the veterans grew quieter, the way the jokes dried up. Even Rolf stopped talking, his knuckles whitening around his bow. The road sloped upward, the trees thinning until they reached the crest of a hill. And there, spread out below them like some grim tapestry, was the battlefield. Blackmire Fen was a vast, soggy stretch of land, half swamp and half graveyard. The enemy's forces were already arrayed on the far side, their banners limp in the damp air. Between them and the king's army lay a no-man's land of reeds, murky water, and if Tomlin's luck held, a very convenient place to disappear. The captain barked orders, positioning the archers along the ridge. Tomlin found himself wedged between Rolf and a wiry teenager who looked even more terrified than he felt. "Just aim for the mass of them," Rolf muttered. "Don't think, just shoot." Tomlin nodded, his mouth dry. He knocked an arrow, his fingers trembling. The command to draw came. He pulled back the string. And that was when he realized, with a slow, creeping horror, that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Chapter 3. The night before the battle. The camp that night was a chorus of snores, farts, and the occasional murmured prayer. Men slept where they had collapsed, bundled in cloaks or sprawled over shields, their faces slack with exhaustion. The lucky ones dreamed. Tomlin envied them. He lay on his back, staring at the sagging fabric of the tent above him, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud. Every time he closed his eyes he saw it, the moment when he would inevitably miss, the arrow veering wildly off course, the laughter of his fellow archers, the slow dawning horror on the captain's face as he realized he had brought a man to war who couldn't hit a barn if he was standing inside it. Tomlin had spent his entire life being passably mediocre at most things, but failure in battle wasn't just embarrassing. It was the kind of thing ballads were written about. The wrong kind of ballads. Next to him, Rolf slept like a man who had already made peace with death. One arm was flung over his face, and he emitted a low, rhythmic growl that might have been a snore, or possibly a small bear hiding in his chest. Across the tent, the wiry teenager, whose name Tomlin still hadn't caught, was curled into a tight ball, shivering despite the warmth of the night. Every so often, he let out a tiny, involuntary whimper, like a dog dreaming of being chased. Tomlin sat up, rubbing his face. He needed air. Or ale. Or possibly a sudden and catastrophic injury that would render him unfit for battle, without being fatal. Carefully, he stepped over the sleeping forms and slipped out into the night. The camp was quieter now. The fires burned down to glowing embers. Sentries paced at the edges, their shadows long and flickering in the dim light. Beyond them, the battlefield lay in silence, the marsh mist curling over the ground like a burial shroud. Somewhere out there, the enemy slept too. Or didn't. Maybe they were just as awake, just as terrified, staring into the same darkness and wondering if dawn would be their last. Tomlin wandered aimlessly, his feet carrying him past rows of tents, past the makeshift smithy where a lone apprentice still hammered dents out of a breastplate, past the healer station where the smell of herbs and blood hung thick in the air. He paused near the supply wagons where a pair of cooks were already stirring giant pots of something that smelled suspiciously like boiled leather. Couldn't sleep. The voice made Tomlin jump. He turned to see the captain leaning against a wagon, chewing on a strip of dried meat. Up close, the man looked even more exhausted than Tomlin felt, his eyes shadowed, his beard unkempt. "No, sir," Tomlin admitted. The captain nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "First battle?" "Yes, sir." "Thought so. You've got that look." The captain took another bite, chewing thoughtfully, like a man waiting for a trapdoor to drop. Tomlin hesitated. "Does it ever get easier?" The captain barked a laugh. "No, but you get better at pretending it does." He tossed the rest of the meat into the fire where it sizzled pathetically. "Listen, lad, you're going to be awful tomorrow. Everyone is. First time you either freeze or you flail. The trick is to do it where no one's looking." This was not comforting. Tomlin opened his mouth to ask another question, but the captain pushed off the wagon and clapped him on the shoulder. "Go back to bed, or don't. Either way, dawn comes whether you're ready or not." With that, he ambled off into the dark, leaving Tomlin alone with his thoughts again. He wandered back toward the tents, his steps slow. As he passed the edge of camp, he heard a soft rhythmic sound, someone sharpening a blade. Curious, he followed the noise to a small clearing where a lone figure sat on a stump, methodically dragging a whetstone along the edge of a dagger. It was the quiet woman from the third flank, the one no one talked to. Tomlin had noticed her before, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. She was slight, her hair cropped short, her face all sharp angles and shadows. She never spoke, never joined in the boasting or the drinking. She just watched, her expression unreadable. Now, in the dim light, her movements were precise, almost hypnotic. The stone whispered against the metal, over and over. Tomlin hesitated, then took a step forward. A twig snapped under his boot. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she went back to sharpening the dagger. Tomlin cleared his throat. Couldn't sleep either. She didn't answer. He shifted awkwardly. I'm Tomlin, from the third flank. Nothing. Right, well, good luck tomorrow. The woman paused, just for a second. Then, in a voice so quiet Tomlin almost thought he imagined it, she said, Luck doesn't win battles. Tomlin blinked. What does? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes. Something cold and certain, not missing. The dagger flashed as she slid it back into its sheath. Then she stood and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Tomlin stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty stump. Then, with a sigh, he turned and trudged back to his tent. Dawn was coming. And with it, the battle. And whether he was ready or not, he would have to face it. Chapter 4. The battle begins. The horns sounded at dawn, their notes slicing through the morning mist like rusty knives. Tomlin had managed perhaps 20 minutes of fitful sleep before the camp erupted into frantic motion around him. Men scrambled into armor, strapped on swords and muttered last-minute prayers to gods who had probably stopped listening years ago. The air smelled of damp wool, cold sweat, and the acrid tang of fear. Tomlin fumbled with his quiver, his fingers numb with exhaustion and dread. The bowstring felt alien in his hands, the fletching of his arrows rough against his fingertips. Around him, the other archers of the third flank moved with practiced efficiency, their faces set in grim masks. Even the wiry teenager from the tent had transformed overnight into something resembling a soldier, his eyes wide but steady. Remember, Rolf grunted as they formed up. Aim for the mass. Don't think. Just loose and knock, loose and knock. Like pissing in the wind. Eventually something's bound to get wet. Tomlin opened his mouth to reply, but the command came before he could speak. The archers moved forward, climbing the slight rise that overlooked Blackmire Fen. The battlefield stretched before them, a nightmare painting of churned mud, stagnant pools, and the distant, shifting mass of the enemy host. Banners flapped limply in the damp air. The occasional glint of morning sun on armor winked like mocking eyes. The captain moved down the line, his voice a low growl. First volley on my mark. Wait for it. Wait for it. Tomlin's mouth was drier than a beggar's purse. His heart hammered so loudly, he was certain the entire army could hear it. He knocked an arrow, the motion clumsy compared to the smooth, practiced movements of the men around him. The bow creaked as he drew back, the string biting into his fingers. A distant drumbeat began, slow and ominous. The enemy was advancing. Draw! 100 bows lifted as one. Tomlin's arms trembled. His vision narrowed, until all he could see was the distant blur of movement, the shapes that were men but looked no larger than ants from this distance. Loose! The air filled with the sound of 100 bowstrings, snapping taut. Arrows hissed skyward in a deadly arc, darkening the morning sky like a sudden storm. Tomlin's shot joined them, or at least he thought it did. He couldn't be sure. His hands had moved on their own, his body operating without his mind's permission. The arrows fell. Somewhere in the distance, screams rose. Again. Tomlin reached for another arrow. His fingers brushed the fletching, then froze. Something was wrong. The arrow he'd just knocked. It was crooked. The fletching was loose, one feather hanging by a thread. It would never fly straight. It would veer off, miss entirely, maybe even loose, damn you. Tomlin released. The arrow flew like a drunk bird, wobbling wildly before vanishing into the misty middle distance. It didn't come anywhere near the enemy. It didn't come anywhere near anything. Around him, the third flank was already knocking their next shots. Tomlin fumbled for another arrow. His hands were sweating now, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Focus, Squirrel Killer," Rolf muttered beside him. Tomlin drew, released. Another miss. The battle raged on beneath them, a swirling chaos of clashing steel and dying men. The archers loosed volley after volley, their arrows thinning the enemy ranks with mechanical precision. Tomlin loosed with them, his shots joining the storm, but where the other's arrows found flesh, his found only dirt or water or empty air. By the fifth volley, he was certain of it. He wasn't hitting anything. Not a single shot. A strange detachment settled over him. The screams, the shouts, the metallic tang of blood in the air, it all faded into a dull hum. He knocked, drew, loosed. Knocked, drew, loosed. Each motion felt more futile than the last. At some point, the enemy archers returned fire. Arrows hissed back toward them, thudding into shields or finding unlucky flesh. A man 2 rows down collapsed with a wet gurgle, an arrow protruding from his throat. Another took one in the thigh and began cursing with impressive creativity. Tomlin kept shooting, kept missing. The battle wore on. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist to reveal the full, ugly truth of the field below. Bodies lay twisted in the mud, some still moving, most not. The enemy advance had stalled, their lines thinning under the relentless hail of arrows. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The enemy horns sounded retreat. Their remaining forces turned, stumbling back through the fen. A ragged cheer rose from the king's men. Tomlin lowered his bow, his arms aching, his fingers raw. Around him, the other archers clapped each other on the back, laughing breathlessly. "Fine shooting, lads," the captain called, moving down the line. Fine shooting, indeed. Tomlin stood very still, staring at his quiver. It was nearly empty. He had loosed 23 arrows. He had missed 23 times. And no one had noticed. The shame burned hotter than any victory cheer. He was a fraud, a ghost on the battlefield, a man who had gone through the motions of war without leaving a single mark. Rolf slapped him on the back. "You live, Squirrel Killer. First battle down." Tomlin forced a smile. "Yeah," he said. "First battle." Somewhere in the distance, crows were already gathering. Tomlin watched them circle, their black shapes dark against the sky. They, at least, would eat well today. But for Tomlin, the battle was far from over. Chapter 5. The first missed. The arrow left his bow with a sound like a sigh, flying straight for all of 3 heartbeats, before veering sharply to the left as if actively avoiding the battlefield. It plunged into the mud halfway between the archer line and the enemy, sticking upright like a sad little flag marking the grave of Tomlin's dignity. He stared at it, blinking, as around him the third flank continued loosing volley after volley of deadly accurate shots. A fluke. That's all it was. Tomlin reached for another arrow, fingers brushing past the fletching of 3 others before settling on one that looked straighter than the rest. His hands were sweating. He wiped them on his tunic, leaving dark streaks on the rough fabric. The bowstring bit into his fingers as he drew back, the wood creaking softly beneath his grip. He exhaled, aimed, and released. This one did not veer. It simply dropped short, disappearing into the marsh with a quiet plop. Tomlin's stomach twisted. That was 2. 2 arrows loosed, 2 arrows wasted. Around him, men were already knocking their next shots, their movements smooth as flowing water. Rolf, to his left, grunted as he loosed another arrow. Tomlin didn't need to follow its path to know it had found its mark. The man shot like breathing, effortless and inevitable. Tomlin's third arrow wobbled in the air, spinning end over end before vanishing into the reeds, somewhere to the right of the enemy formation. A laugh burst from one of the younger archers nearby, quickly stifled. "Wind's tricky today," Rolf muttered, not unkindly. Tomlin nodded, throat tight. The wind wasn't the problem. The fourth arrow slipped from his fingers too soon, skittering along the ground like a startled rabbit before coming to rest a few paces in front of their position. The wiry teenager from the tent, Ulrich, Tomlin had finally learned his name, glanced at him, brow furrowed. "You all right?" "Fine," Tomlin lead. His fifth shot was his most spectacular yet. It soared high, higher than any of the others, a perfect arc that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so utterly wrong. It cleared the entire battlefield, disappearing into the trees beyond the enemy host. Someone from the second flank swore loudly as it narrowly missed their standard bearer. Tomlin's face burned. His hands shook. He fumbled for another arrow, but the motions felt distant, as if he were watching someone else move his limbs. The battle raged on beneath them. The enemy's advance had slowed under the rain of arrows. But Tomlin knew with a sick certainty that none of those arrows had been his. He was a spectator in this war, a man holding a bow but leaving no mark on the field. By the 10th miss, a strange numbness had settled over him. His fingers moved mechanically, knocking, drawing, loosing, knocking, drawing, loosing. Each shot was worse than the last. One clipped the edge of a shield, spinning off into the distance. Another buried itself in the carcass of a horse already dead. And then, as if the gods themselves had decided to twist the knife, Tomlin's 15th arrow did hit something. Not the enemy. Not even the ground. With a sound like a wet slap, it struck the captain's helm, glancing off the curved metal with enough force to leave a dent, but not enough to do real damage. The man whirled, eyes scanning the ranks for the culprit. Tomlin froze, his breath caught in his chest. For one terrible moment, their eyes met. Then the captain turned away, bellowing orders to the front lines. Tomlin did not move. He did not breathe. The shame was a living thing now, coiled tight in his gut, whispering in his ear. "You are worse than useless. You are a danger to your own side." Around him the battle continued. Arrows flying, men shouting, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. As if he had never been there at all. Tomlin knocked another arrow. He did not fire. Instead, he stood there, bow half raised, watching as the battle unfolded without him. The enemy was retreating now, their lines breaking under the relentless assault. The king's forces cheered, a ragged, exhausted sound. It was over, and Tomlin had missed every single shot. Rolf clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll get aim next time, squirrel killer." Tomlin said nothing, because next time he knew would be no different. Chapter 6. The second attempt. The morning after the battle dawned gray and damp, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Tomlin sat by the remnants of a campfire, methodically running his thumb along the fletching of his remaining arrows. They looked back at him, silent and accusatory. A shadow fell across him. He glanced up to see Rolf looming, a hunk of bread in one hand and a cup of something steaming in the other. "They're calling it a great victory," Rolf said, tearing off a piece of bread and offering it to Tomlin. Tomlin took it without enthusiasm. "Yeah," Rolf grunted, lowering himself onto a log with a creak of leather. "You going to tell me what's wrong, or do I have to guess?" Tomlin hesitated. The bread tasted like ash in his mouth. "I missed." Rolf took a sip from his cup. "Everyone misses." "Not like that." Rolf studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Come on." Tomlin blinked. "What?" "Up. We're going to the range." The range was a makeshift affair at the edge of camp, a few straw targets set up against a line of trees, already peppered with arrows from earlier practice. A handful of other archers were there, chatting idly as they loosed shots at the targets. They nodded to Rolf as he approached, their eyes sliding curiously over Tomlin, before they turned away. Rolf handed Tomlin his bow. "Show me." Tomlin's fingers tightened around the wood. He could feel the eyes of the other archers on him now, watching, waiting. His palms began to sweat. He nocked an arrow, drew back, and froze. Rolf frowned. "What are you waiting for?" Tomlin exhaled sharply and released. The arrow flew straight for all of 2 heartbeats before veering sharply right, burying itself in the trunk of a tree with a solid thunk. A snort of laughter came from one of the watching archers. Tomlin's face burned. Rolf shot the man a glare before turning back to Tomlin. "Again." Tomlin swallowed. He adjusted his stance, planted his feet more firmly in the damp earth, drew the string back until his fingers touched his cheek. The arrow snapped against the same tree, the shaft splintering with a sound like breaking bones. More laughter, louder this time. Tomlin's hands shook. Rolf stepped closer, his voice low. "You're thinking too much." "I'm not thinking at all," Tomlin muttered. "That's the problem." Rolf reached out, adjusting Tomlin's grip on the bow. "You're holding it like it's going to bite you. Relax." Tomlin tried. He really did. But the laughter still echoed in his ears, the weight of their stares pressing down on him like a physical thing. His next shot went wide again. And the next. And the one after that. By the 5th miss, even Rolf looked pained. The other archers had lost interest, turning back to their own practice, but their occasional glances stung worse than the outright laughter had. Tomlin lowered his bow. "I can't do it." Rolf studied him for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he took the bow from Tomlin's hands. "Watch Dine." He knocked an arrow, drew, and released in one smooth motion. The arrow struck the center of the target with a solid thwack. Tomlin blinked. "How?" Rolf handed the bow back. "You're trying too hard." Tomlin stared at the bow in his hands, then at the target, then back at the bow. The wood felt alien in his grip, the string like a live thing waiting to betray him. "Just..." Rolf rubbed his forehead. "Pretend it's a squirrel." Tomlin huffed a laugh despite himself. He drew again, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and imagined the target was nothing more than a particularly arrogant pumpkin in his neighbor's garden. The arrow flew. It missed, but it was closer. Rolf clapped him on the shoulder. Progress. Tomlin wasn't sure he'd call it that. But as he reached for another arrow, something in his chest unclenched, just a little. He'd missed. But he'd try again. And maybe, just maybe, eventually, he'd hit something. Chapter 7. The Third Shot and Beyond. The third arrow didn't simply miss. It performed a graceful arc over the target, soared past the trees behind it, and was last seen disappearing into the forest with the cheerful indifference of a bird that had somewhere better to be. Tomlin stared after it, his mouth slightly open. Rolf scratched his beard. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "that's a new one." Tomlin's fourth attempt caught a sudden gust of wind, spun twice in midair like a dancer showing off, and embedded itself in the ground directly between the feet of a passing cook. The man yelped, dropped his pot of stew, and proceeded to curse in a language so creatively foul even the veteran soldiers looked impressed. By the 5th shot, a small crowd had gathered. Not to help, of course, just to watch. Tomlin knocked his arrow, drew back the string, closed his eyes just for a moment. When he released, the arrow flew straight and true, directly into the target stand, splitting the wooden post cleanly down the middle and sending the entire apparatus collapsing in a cloud of dust. Someone in the crowd started clapping. The 6th arrow somehow managed to hit the same tree as his second attempt, striking with such perfect precision that it split the previous arrow down the middle, embedding itself exactly where its predecessor had been. A mathematician in the crowd made an appreciative noise. Tomlin's 7th shot went straight up. Everyone watched in silence as the arrow climbed, paused at its apex, and began its descent. The crowd scattered like startled quail as it came whistling back down, planting itself upright in the exact spot where Tomlin had been standing moments before. Rolf, who had dragged him out of the way just in time, sighed deeply. Maybe we should try something else. But Tomlin, his jaw set, reached for another arrow. The 8th shot ricocheted off a rock, clipped the edge of a passing cart, and startled a nearby horse so badly it kicked over 3 tents. The 9th arrow vanished entirely. Years later, a farmer would find it embedded in his hayloft, nearly a mile from the camp, with no explanation for how it got there. The 10th and final arrow of the morning did something Tomlin wouldn't have believed if he hadn't seen it himself. It left the bow normally enough, but halfway to the target it suddenly veered left, then right, then looped around in a complete circle before burying itself in the ground at his own feet. A stunned silence fell over the gathered soldiers. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone whispered, "How?" Tomlin had no answer. He stood there, staring at the arrow trembling in the dirt between his boots, and felt something inside him shift. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't mere incompetence. This was something approaching artistry. A perfect, flawless record of failure so complete it circled back around to being impressive. Rolf cleared his throat. "On the bright side," he said slowly, "you're definitely not going to hit any of our own men in the next battle." Tomlin blinked. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed. It started as a small chuckle, then grew into something louder and more genuine, until he was doubled over, hands on his knees, laughing until tears streamed down his face. The crowd, uncertain at first, began to laugh with him. Someone clapped him on the back. Someone else offered him a flask. And just like that, without ever meaning to, Tomlin had become something far more valuable to the army than a competent archer. He'd become entertainment. As the group dispersed, still chuckling, Rolf stayed behind. He studied Tomlin for a long moment, then nodded. "You're taking this better than I expected." Tomlin wiped his eyes. "What else can I do?" Rolf considered this. "You could take up the loot," he said finally. "But for everyone's sake, please don't." Tomlin grinned and reached for another arrow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, stubborn voice whispered that the next one would hit its mark. It didn't, of course. But as the sun climbed higher over the camp, and his arrows continued their improbable journeys to every conceivable destination except the target, Tomlin found he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. After all, he'd set out to be remembered in this war. One way or another, it seemed he would be. Chapter 8. The enemy's confusion. The next battle began as battles do, with a great deal of shouting, the ominous beating of drums, and the metallic scent of fear hanging thick in the air. Tomlin took his place in the third flank, his fingers clenched tight around his bow. Around him, seasoned archers checked their strings and counted arrows with practiced ease. When the signal came to loose the first volley, Tomlin's arrow flew with all the others, only to curve wildly off course and impale a harmless shrub some 20 paces to the left of the enemy lines. On the opposite side of the field, a young enemy soldier named Edric blinked. "Did you see that?" he asked the grizzled veteran beside him. The veteran, who had survived 7 battles through a combination of skill and sheer stubbornness, frowned. "See what?" "That arrow. It—" Edric gestured vaguely toward the shrub, now sporting a new decoration. "It went sideways." The veteran squinted. "Been's tricky today." But as the battle wore on, more soldiers in the enemy ranks began noticing the peculiar phenomenon. While most of the king's archers sent deadly rain after deadly rain into their formations, one particular shaft in every volley behaved differently. Tomlin's second arrow of the day struck a rock, and ricocheted straight up, spinning end over end before plunging point first into a supply wagon's wheel, locking it in place. The quartermaster slapped his forehead as the axle groaned in protest. A pair of enemy scouts watched this unfold with matching expressions of bewilderment. "Is that part of their strategy?" one asked. The other scratched his head. Maybe they're trying to immobilize our wagons with one arrow. Could be a warning shot. The third arrow soared clean over the battlefield entirely, landing in a startled duck pond nearly half a mile behind enemy lines. A goose that would later be credited with heroic vigilance sounded the alarm. By Tomlin's fourth shot, enemy commanders had taken notice. A grizzled captain with a nose like a broken axe blade stared as the errant projectile whistled past his ear, did a perfect loop-the-loop, and embedded itself in a passing supply officer's ledger. "Are they mocking us?" the captain growled. His lieutenant, a man with considerably more education but less common sense, stroked his chin. Perhaps it's psychological warfare, unconventional tactics to undermine morale. The captain watched as Tomlin's fifth arrow plucked an apple cleanly from a tree behind their lines and carried it, wobbling but intact, all the way back to the king's forces, where it landed neatly in Rolf's outstretched hand. "That," the captain said slowly, "is either the worst archer I've ever seen or some sort of mad genius." As the battle raged on, a strange phenomenon occurred. Enemy soldiers began watching for Tomlin's shots, tracking their bizarre trajectories with a sort of horrified fascination. Men who should have been ducking for cover instead stood transfixed as his arrows performed aerial acrobatics no fletched shaft had any business attempting. One particularly memorable shot struck an enemy shield, bounced off at an improbable angle, and snagged the commander's hat clean off his head, carrying it aloft like a bizarre war banner before depositing it in a thorn bush. The commander, to his credit, took this in stride. "At least they're not shooting us," he remarked to his stunned aides. Meanwhile, on the king's side of the field, Tomlin had become an unlikely celebrity. Soldiers cheered as each new shot flew, placing bets on where it might land. A particularly enterprising squire began running a book, offering odds on various improbable outcomes. 3-1, it hits a bird. 5-1, it circles back to our own lines. 10-1, it starts a fire somehow. Rolf, watching this unfold with a mixture of pride and resignation, leaned close to Tomlin. "You realize you've invented an entirely new form of warfare, right?" Tomlin groaned as his next arrow somehow managed to thread itself through 3 separate tree branches before coming to rest in a squirrel's nest. The squirrel, thoroughly unimpressed, began gnawing on the shaft. "I'm not trying to," he muttered. But try or not, something remarkable was happening. Where enemy soldiers might normally have been filled with battle rage, they now found themselves distracted, confused, and increasingly amused. The rhythm of combat had been broken by sheer absurdity. When Tomlin's next arrow sailed over the front lines and neatly untied the laces of an enemy knight's boot, causing the man to trip spectacularly during his charge, even the opposing side couldn't help but laugh. The battle, which should have been a bloody, hard-fought affair, instead took on the air of a particularly violent carnival. Men on both sides found themselves watching the skies, waiting for the next improbable shot. And as the sun began to set on what historians would later record as that really weird battle at Blackmire Fen, an unexpected truth became clear. Tomlin might not have hit a single enemy combatant, but he'd won the battle anyway. Chapter 9. The Captain's Disbelief. Captain Brysant had seen many things in his years of service, men charging bravely into certain death, cowardly deserters fleeing in the night, even a horse, once that somehow managed to get drunk on fermented apples and tried to fight a cart. But nothing in his long military career had prepared him for the spectacle currently unfolding before him. He stood frozen, his weathered face caught in a rictus of conflicting emotions, as another of Tomlin's arrows performed what could only be described as an aerial ballet before embedding itself in a supply cart's wheel. The same cart, Brysant noted with dawning horror, that 3 previous arrows had already struck in precisely the same spot. The wheel now resembled a porcupine with a woodworking hobby. "By all the gods," Brysant whispered. His fingers twitched toward his sword, then his flask, then simply hung in the air as if unsure what form of violence or comfort might possibly address this situation. Nearby, one of his lieutenants cleared his throat. "Should we do something, sir?" Brisant's eye developed a noticeable twitch. "Like what, exactly? Court-martial the laws of physics?" He gestured wildly toward where Tomlin was knocking another arrow, with the serene confidence of a man who had completely given up on conventional expectations. "That shouldn't be possible. Arrows don't do that." As if to underscore his point, Tomlin's next shot struck a low-flying bird, not harming it, but somehow getting tangled in its feet, and was carried in increasingly panicked circles above the battlefield before the bird finally shook it loose directly into an enemy commander's soup bowl. The resulting splash drew a startled yelp that carried clearly across the momentarily hushed battlefield. Brisant made a small wounded noise in the back of his throat. "He's getting better," the lieutenant observed unhelpfully. "Better?" Brisant's voice cracked. "Better at what? Performance art? Avian harassment? Culinary sabotage?" He rubbed his temples. "I've seen recruits wet themselves less in their first battle." The next arrow flew straight and true, directly toward Brisant's head. The captain had approximately half a second to contemplate the irony before the shaft veered sharply upward at the last possible moment, snagging his helmet plume and carrying it aloft like a battle standard for the forces of chaos. Silence fell across the command position. The lieutenant bit his lip so hard it bled. Brisant reached up slowly to touch his now bare helmet. When he spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. "I want that man." "To punish, sir?" the lieutenant ventured. "To study," Brisant corrected, his eyes gleaming with something between scientific curiosity and incipient madness. "Do you realize what we're witnessing? Either the worst archer in recorded history, or a man who's discovered an entirely new form of projectile-based psychological warfare." He watched as Tomlin's next arrow somehow managed to thread itself through 3 separate sets of armor strap before coming to rest as a makeshift belt for a very confused enemy foot soldier. "I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more." On the front lines, Tomlin remained blissfully unaware of the existential crisis he'd sparked in the command tent. He was too busy marveling at his latest shot, an arrow that had somehow traveled backward through his own ranks before landing gently in his quiver, as if even the fletching had grown tired of this nonsense. Rolf, who had long since transitioned from mentor to bemused spectator, clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, most archers go their whole careers without developing a signature style." Tomlin groaned. "This isn't a style. It's a public health hazard." Behind them, unnoticed by either man, Captain Brisant had begun taking notes. His journal, which would later be found by historians and dismissed as obvious exaggeration, read, "Day 1 of observation. Subject continues to defy all known ballistic principles. Have ordered scouts to watch for any signs he's actually a wizard. Have also ordered extra wine." As the sun dipped below the horizon, marking the end of another day in which Tomlin had failed to hit a single enemy combatant, Brisant came to a startling realization. He was looking forward to tomorrow. Somewhere in the back of his tactical mind, a small voice whispered that he should probably be concerned about this. He poured himself another drink and told the voice to shut up. Chapter 10. The battle ends without him. The horns sounded the retreat, their mournful wail cutting through the smoke and clamor of the battlefield. All around Tomlin, men cheered, clapped each other on the back, and praised the gods for their survival. The enemy was withdrawing, their formations broken, their spirit drained by days of relentless harassment, not from Tomlin's arrows, of course, but from the sheer psychological toll of witnessing their flight patterns. Tomlin stood motionless in the center of the cheering army, his quiver empty, his bow hanging limp at his side. At his feet lay the scattered remains of his efforts, dozens of arrows, not a single one having found its intended mark. Some had returned to him like faithful dogs, dropping harmlessly at his boots after their improbable journeys. Others had vanished entirely, perhaps starting new lives in distant lands. One, he'd been told, had somehow ended up in the enemy commander's personal bathtub, a discovery that reportedly prompted the man to immediately call for peace talks. Rolf materialized beside him, smelling of sweat and victory. "We did it," he roared, shaking Tomlin so hard his teeth rattled. Another glorious triumph for the king's forces. Tomlin stared at his hands. "I didn't hit anyone," he said quietly. Rolf blinked. "What?" "Not one." Tomlin held up his empty quiver. 47 arrows. 47 shots. Not a single enemy struck." Rolf opened his mouth, then closed it again. His brow furrowed as he performed the mental arithmetic. That's actually impressive," he said at last. "Statistically speaking, you'd think you'd have hit someone by accident at least once." Tomlin groaned and sank to his knees. Around them, the celebration continued unabated. Someone had started a drinking song. A group of soldiers were roasting what appeared to be the enemy's field kitchen over a captured supply wagon. The air smelled of burning flour and unearned triumph. Captain Bryson found them like that, Tomlin kneeling in existential despair, Rolf patting his shoulder with the awkward sympathy of a man who had never comforted anyone in his life. Bryson cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "that was certainly something." Tomlin didn't look up. "You should flog me." "Flog you?" Bryson rubbed his chin. "Son, I'm considering promoting you." Tomlin's head snapped up so fast, something in his neck popped. "What?" Bryson gestured to the battlefield. "Do you have any idea what you've accomplished? The enemy is in full retreat. Their commander specifically asked if that demon archer would be at the peace talks. They're convinced you were some sort of supernatural omen." He shook his head in wonder. "You didn't just miss every shot. You missed so spectacularly that you won the battle." Tomlin opened his mouth, then closed it again. The absurdity of the situation settled over him like a warm, slightly scratchy blanket. Rolf grinned. "Told you you'd be remembered." As night fell, and the camp erupted into full celebration, Tomlin sat by the fire, turning an arrow over in his hands. The same soldiers who had mocked him days earlier now offered him drinks, clapped him on the back, and begged him to demonstrate his technique. Even the quiet woman from the third flank, the one who never spoke, nodded at him with what might have been respect. Across the fire, someone started a new song, a bawdy ballad about the archer who couldn't hit the broadside of a castle. To Tomlin's surprise, he found himself laughing along. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more arrows, more opportunities for humiliating failure. But for tonight, at least, he was a hero. And as he drifted off to sleep, the sounds of revelry still echoing through the camp, Tomlin realized something strange. He was looking forward to tomorrow. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted. Far away, in the enemy camp, a sentry shivered and tightened his grip on his spear. And in a tree halfway between the two armies, 47 perfectly good arrows waited patiently for their next adventure. Chapter 11. The Walk of Shame. The return to camp should have been triumphant. The king's forces had won after all. But as Tomlin trudged through the mud with his empty quiver slung across his back, he might as well have been marching to his own execution. Every step felt heavier than the last, each footprint filling immediate with icy water that seeped through his boots. The other archers moved around him like he was a boulder in a stream, giving him wide berth, their eyes sliding away whenever he glanced in their direction. Even the usual clatter of gear and weapons seemed muted in his presence, as if the very air had decided to participate in the collective shunning. Only Rolf remained at his side, a solid, unshakable presence that somehow made the whole thing worse. His loyalty was a spotlight, illuminating Tomlin's failure for all to see. They passed the quartermaster's tent, where a group of squires had gathered to count arrows. One held up Tomlin's most infamous shot, the one that had circled back 3 times before lodging itself in a supply crate marked fragile. "Do not shoot." The boy's laughter cut off abruptly when he noticed Tomlin watching. Further on, near the healer's station, Tomlin caught snippets of conversation drifting through the canvas walls. "Not a single hit in 3 battles. They say his arrows actually avoid people. Must be cursed." Tomlin's face burned. His hands curled into fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms. He wanted to shout, to explain, to tell them he'd tried, damn it. But the words stuck in his throat like spoiled meat. At the archery range, a group of new recruits were being put through their paces. The instructor, a grizzled veteran missing 2 fingers on his right hand, paused mid-demonstration to glare at Tomlin. "And that," he said loudly to the wide-eyed trainees, "is exactly what you don't do." The walk felt endless. Past the mess tents where cooks pretended not to stare. Past the armorers who suddenly found their hammers very interesting. Past the command tent where Captain Bryson stood watching, his expression unreadable. Finally, mercifully, they reached the 3rd flank section of camp. Tomlin's tent stood exactly as he'd left it, though it seemed smaller now, as if even the canvas had contracted in shame. He reached for the flap. "Wait," the voice came from behind him. The quiet woman, the one who never spoke, stood there, holding something wrapped in oilcloth. She thrust it at him without ceremony. Tomlin unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a single arrow, perfectly fletched, its shaft straight as a sunbeam. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of arrow reserved for kings and champions. He looked up, confused. The woman met his gaze for the first time since he'd known her. "Tomorrow?" she said, then turned and walked away. Tomlin stood there holding the arrow, watching her disappear into the gloom between the tents. Around him the camp went about its business, men laughing, fires crackling, the occasional burst of song. Life moving on. He looked down at the arrow again. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was, he realized with dawning horror, a test. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The sound was almost, but not quite, like laughter. Tomlin ducked into his tent, clutching the arrow like a lifeline. Outside, the camp carried on without him. Tomorrow would come, and with it, one last shot. Chapter 12. The King's Mercy. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a stone-faced herald who looked at Tomlin as if he were a particularly vexing puzzle. The king wished to see him. Immediately. Tomlin's stomach dropped to somewhere near his knees. He'd heard stories of what happened to soldiers who disappointed their monarchs, the dungeons, the floggings, the creative uses of hot irons. He clutched the perfect arrow the quiet woman had given him, its smooth wood now damp with sweat from his palms. The royal tent was larger than the entire village Tomlin had grown up in, its golden banners snapping in the morning breeze. Guards in polished armor flanked the entrance, their expressions unreadable behind their visors. As Tomlin approached, one shifted slightly, and he was certain he heard a muffled snort. Inside, the air smelled of incense and expensive leather. King Edric the Even-Tempered, a nickname that had never been meant literally, sat sprawled on a carved wooden chair, idly turning a goblet of wine in one hand. He was younger than Tomlin had expected, with sharp features and the easy grace of a man who had spent more time on battlefields than in court. Captain Bryson stood to one side, his face carefully neutral. The quiet woman was there too, lurking near the back like a shadow given human form. Tomlin dropped to one knee, his throat too tight to speak. The king sipped his wine. "So," he said at last, "you're the archer who can't shoot straight." Tomlin winced. "Your Majesty, Stand up," the king interrupted. "Let me look at you." Tomlin rose on unsteady legs. The king's gaze was uncomfortably perceptive, like being studied by a particularly intelligent hawk. After a long moment, the king's lips twitched. Then, to Tomlin's utter shock, he burst out laughing. It was a rich, booming sound that filled the tent and set the wine sloshing in his goblet. "By the gods," the king wheezed, wiping his eyes. "I haven't been this entertained since my uncle tried to poison me with a pudding." He leaned forward, suddenly serious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tomlin shook his head mutely. "You've become famous," the king said. "The enemy is convinced you're some sort of sorcerer. My own men think you're touched by the gods. And do you know what I think?" Tomlin braced himself. "I think," the king continued, "that history will remember you long after it's forgotten me." He took another sip of wine. "That's why I've decided to spare your life." Tomlin blinked. "Sire?" "Oh, don't look so surprised," the king said. "You're far too valuable to execute. In fact," he gestured to a scribe lurking in the corner, "I'm having your exploits recorded for posterity. Every last ridiculous miss. Consider it a gift." The scribe bowed, holding up a parchment already half filled with cramped writing. Tomlin caught the words "remarkable incompetence" before looking away. The king stood, draining his goblet. "You'll be given an honorable discharge, of course, and a pension." He smirked. "Can't have my newest legend starving in a ditch. Can we?" Tomlin opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't sure whether to thank the man or beg for a proper punishment. The king seemed to understand. He clapped Tomlin on the shoulder, a gesture that nearly sent him back to his knees, and leaned in close. "Just do me one favor," he murmured. "Never pick up a bow again." Outside, the camp was waking up properly now, the smell of cooking fires replacing the morning chill. Tomlin walked back to his tent in a daze, the perfect arrow still clutched in his hand. Rolf was waiting for him, grinning like a madman. "Well?" Tomlin held up the arrow, studied its flawless fletching one last time, then snapped it over his knee. The sound was louder than he'd expected, like a bone breaking. Rolf's grin faded. "What are you going to do now?" Tomlin looked around at the camp, at the men who had once mocked him, at the life he'd somehow survived, despite himself. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll take up farming." And with that, history's worst archer walked away from war into a future where the only things he'd need to hit were the broadsides of barns. Somewhere, an owl hooted. It sounded almost like applause. Chapter 13. The Legend Grows. By the time Tomlin reached the first village on his journey home, the stories had already begun to outpace him. He had barely settled onto a stool in the local tavern when he overheard a mercenary with an eye patch spinning a tale to a rapt audience. "They say his arrows don't just miss," the man declared, slamming his tankard for emphasis. "They turn back mid-flight and salute him before falling at his feet." Tomlin choked on his ale. In the next town over, the story had grown teeth, quite literally. A traveling minstrel performed a ballad about the phantom archer whose shots passed through solid stone to tickle sleeping enemies awake. Children played in the streets, taking turns being the cursed bowman who could shoot an apple off someone's head without ever touching the fruit. At a roadside inn near the capital, Tomlin listened in horrified fascination as a scholar explained to his companions how the king had secretly employed reverse psychology archery as an ingenious battle tactic. "The misses are deliberate, you see," the man said, adjusting his spectacles. "Each errant shot contains encrypted messages that terrify the enemy." The truth, as it so often does, became buried under an avalanche of increasingly ridiculous embellishments. By midsummer, Tomlin heard a version where his arrows could cure gout. By harvest time, pilgrims were leaving offerings at roadside shrines dedicated to Saint Miscelet. The quiet woman, whose name Tomlin never did learn, appeared one evening at a crossroads tavern where he sat contemplating his unwanted fame. She slid onto the bench opposite him without a word, her hands cradling a cup of something dark and steaming. "Did you know?" she said quietly. "They're using your story to train new archers now." Tomlin groaned into his drink. "Let me guess, as a warning?" She shook her head. the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. As inspiration, the master archer tells them if they can't hit the target, they should at least miss with style. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The sound was almost, but not quite, like laughter. Tomlin stared into his cup, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface of the ale. He had set out to be remembered in this war, just not like this. Never like this. And yet, as the quiet woman slipped back into the night as silently as she'd come, Tomlin realized something peculiar. The shame had faded. The embarrassment had dulled. All that remained was the story, ridiculous, improbable, and utterly, inescapably his. He took another sip of ale. It tasted surprisingly like acceptance. Somewhere in the kingdom, another version of his legend was being born in the flickering light of another tavern's fire. Tomlin smiled to himself and raised his cup in silent toast to whatever absurdity would come next. The owl hooted again. This time, it definitely sounded amused. Chapter 14. The Archer's Defense. The tavern was called the Tipsy Quiver, an establishment Tomlin would later swear had been named specifically to mock him. 3 ales deep, and rapidly descending into philosophical debate with his own reflection in the polished brass behind the bar, he finally gave voice to the thoughts that had been festering since Blackmire Fen. It wasn't my fault, he declared to no one in particular, though a pair of merchants at a nearby table pricked up their ears at the familiar tone of a man about to make a spectacular fool of himself. Tomlin jabbed a finger at his empty tankard for emphasis. The wind, he announced, was conspiring against me. He nodded sagely, as if this explained everything. Not normal wind, mind you. Special wind, clever wind, wind with a grudge. One of the merchants, a round-faced man with the patient expression of someone who had heard many drunkards explain the fundamental unfairness of the universe, leaned forward. Is that so? Tomlin took this as encouragement. And the bow. He threw up his hands, nearly toppling from his stool. The king's own Fletcher gave me a defective bow. Had to be. The thing had a personality disorder. He mimed drawing an arrow with dramatic flourish. You'd pull back, and it would just shudder in your hands like a spooked horse. The tavern keeper, who had heard every excuse for bad marksmanship from the sun, was in my eyes to my mother, didn't love me enough, snorted as he refilled Tomlin's tankard without being asked. What about the arrows? Tomlin seized on this like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. The arrows. His voice rose to a pitch normally reserved for announcing the apocalypse. The thing was all wrong. Someone, probably the same bastard who trained that wind, used owl feathers. Owl feathers! He leaned in conspiratorially. Everyone knows owls can't keep secrets. Their feathers make arrows gossipy. At this point, the tavern's resident bard, a wiry fellow who had been tuning his lute with increasing disinterest, perked up. That's not how fletching works, he pointed out helpfully. Tomlin fixed him with a glare that had once made a charging boar reconsider its life choices. Says who? Says physics, the bard replied, though he was already scribbling notes for what would later become the popular ballad The Archer Who Blamed the Birds. Unde terret. Tomlin continued his defense with the single-minded determination of a man who had found his hill, and was prepared to die drunk on it. And the battlefield. You ever try shooting in a swamp? The humidity alone makes the air thicker than porridge. Arrows get tired. They lose heart. He nodded solemnly. Happened to Alexander the Great's archers. Historical fact. The second merchant, who had been quietly calculating how much he could charge people in the next town to hear this nonsense firsthand, frowned. I thought Alexander fought in deserts. Tomlin waved this away with all the authority of a man who had definitely not been paying attention during history lessons. Same in principle. Arrows are temperamental, like cats or wives. He paused, considering. Or cats who are wives. At this point, Rolf appeared in the doorway, having tracked his friend through 3 villages based solely on the growing trail of outrageous excuses. He took one look at Tomlin's flushed face and the rapidly filling tankard before him, and sighed the sigh of a man who had seen this play before and knew exactly how it ended. "Come on, Squirrel Killer," he said, holding Tomlin to his feet. "Time to get you home before you start blaming the moon." Tomlin, who had in fact been working up to a perfectly reasonable explanation involving lunar tides and arrow-magnetism, allowed himself to be steered toward the door. "It's not my fault," he muttered again, though the fight was draining from his voice along with the ale-induced courage. Rolf patted him on the back with the gentle condescension of a man who had once seen Tomlin try to shoot a stationary hay bale from 10 paces and miss the entire barn. "Horse, it isn't," he agreed easily. "It's the fault of everyone who ever made an arrow, fletched an arrow, or looked at an arrow funny." Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted, an ordinary owl, with perfectly normal feathers that definitely didn't affect ballistics in any way. Tomlin squinted at the sky. "You think it's laughing at me?" Rolf didn't answer. Some questions, he had learned, were better left to philosophers, drunkards, and bards who needed material for their next song. Together they staggered down the road, leaving behind a tavern full of people who would be telling the story of the cursed archer's excuses for years to come. The legend, it seemed, was still growing. And at the center of it all, blissfully unaware of the ballad currently being composed in his honor, Tomlin continued muttering about vindictive wind patterns all the way home. Chapter 15. The Chronicler's Visit. Tomlin was knee-deep in turnips when the stranger arrived. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, painting the field in hues of gold and amber, as he wrestled another stubborn root from the earth. Farming, he had discovered, was blessedly free of moving targets and unreasonable expectations. You put seeds in the ground, you waited, and if something grew, you called it a victory. The crunch of footsteps on dry grass made him look up. A thin man in scholar's robes stood at the edge of the field, clutching a writing board to his chest like a shield. His nose was dusted with freckles from too much time indoors, and his boots, clearly expensive and equally clearly unused to actual walking, were already coated in a fine layer of road dust. "You are him, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice quivering with poorly contained excitement. "The archer of Blackmire Fen?" Tomlin wiped his hands on his tunic, leaving earthy streaks across the fabric. "I prefer Tomlin the turnip farmer these days." The scholar either didn't hear or chose to ignore this. "Master Willem of the Royal Archives," he announced with a bow so deep it nearly toppled him into the freshly turned soil. "I've been commissioned to document your military career for the King's Chronicles." Tomlin sighed. He'd known this day would come eventually. "How much do you already know?" Willem's eyes sparkled with the fervor of a man about to discuss his life's work. "All the popular accounts, of course. The arrows that changed direction mid-flight, the shots that somehow returned to your quiver, the time you allegedly struck 7 different objects with a single shaft without hitting a single enemy combatant." He flipped through his notes. "Those sources differ on whether the 7th object was a wagon wheel or the captain's dignity." Tomlin grimaced. "It was both." Willem nearly dropped his inkpot in excitement. "Fascinating. And the incident with the goose?" "There was no goose. The bathtub arrow." Tomlin rubbed his temples. "That one might have happened." For the next 3 hours, Willem interrogated him with the intensity of a prosecutor at a treason trial. He demanded exact numbers of arrows loosed, precise angles of errant shots, and, most painfully, a detailed account of Tomlin's thoughts during what the scholar insisted on calling the miracle of total inaccuracy. "Did you feel any divine presence during your worst misses?" Willem pressed, quill poised. "Perhaps a sense of otherworldly guidance?" Tomlin stared at him. "I felt embarrassed." Willem scribbled furiously. "Ah, the humility of the truly gifted." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and pink, Tomlin finally put his foot down. "Look," he said, hefting a basket of turnips onto his hip. "I was bad at archery. That's the beginning and end of it." Willem's face fell like a child told his pet frog had died. But history demands more. The people need to understand." Tomlin sighed and handed the scholar a turnip. "Here, document this." Willem turned the vegetable over in his hands, clearly searching for metaphorical significance. "Is this symbolic of your journey?" "It's dinner." Tomlin started toward his cottage. "You're welcome to stay, if you promise to stop talking about arrows." That night, over a simple meal of turnip stew and slightly burnt bread, Willem finally stopped asking questions long enough to eat. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Somewhere outside an owl hooted, the same one that had followed Tomlin home from the war, if he wasn't mistaken. As Willem devoured his third bowl, he suddenly looked up. "You realize," he said through a mouthful of turnip, "that nothing like this will ever happen again? 1,000 years from now, people will still be telling your story." Tomlin poked at the fire with a stick. "They'll get it wrong." "Of course they will." Willem beamed. "That's the best part." In the morning, the scholar departed with his notes, his ink-stained fingers, and, despite Tomlin's protests, one of the misshapen turnips, he insisted, would make a splendid paperweight for his eventual masterpiece. Tomlin watched him go, the autumn sun warm on his face. The field stretched before him, peaceful and predictable. No moving targets, no expectations, just earth and sky and the quiet certainty of growing things. He picked up his hoe and got back to work. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Tomlin smiled. Let history have its say. He had turnips to tend. Chapter 16. The Archer's New Role. The stables smelled of warm hay and leather, of horses and honest sweat. Tomlin breathed it in as he leaned against his pitchfork, watching dust motes dance in the shafts of morning light that pierced through cracks in the wooden walls. This was his domain now. 12 stalls, 8 geldings, 4 mares, and an ancient mule named Bertram, who seemed to regard the world with perpetual disappointment. No one cheered here. No one jeered. The horses didn't care about his failures, and Bertram had clearly seen worse. "Move your feet, Archer," called old Heston, the stable-master, as he limped down the aisle. The man had more scars than teeth, and walked like his knees remembered every mile they'd ever traveled. "That hay won't spread itself." Tomlin smiled and set to work. There was a rhythm to this labor, the thrust of the fork, the arc of the hay, the satisfying thud as it landed in the stall. No one expected him to hit a target. No one watched with bated breath to see if he'd succeed or fail. The horses only cared that the hay arrived, not how it got there. In the corner stall, a chestnut mare lifted her head as he approached. She was new, arrived just yesterday, skittish from the march, her coat still dull from hard travel. Tomlin moved slowly, letting her see him, smell him. When he offered a handful of hay, she hesitated, then lipped it gently from his palm. "See," he murmured. "No arrows here." The mare blew warm air against his shirt. By midday, when the sun turned the stables into an oven and sweat made his tunic cling to his back, Tomlin paused to wipe his brow. Outside he could hear the shouts of drilling soldiers, the twang of bowstrings from the practice range. His hands didn't itch for the weapon anymore. Old Heston appeared beside him, offering a water skin. "You're not half bad at this," he observed, squinting at the neatly mucked stalls. Tomlin drank deeply. The water tasted of leather and summer. "It's harder to miss with a pitchfork." The stablemaster barked a laugh that startled a pigeon from the rafters. "Aye, and the horses don't write songs about your failures." He clapped Tomlin on the shoulder. "Come on then. Bertram's looking judgmental, and that means he wants his hooves picked." Tomlin followed, the straw crunching under his boots. Bertram did indeed look profoundly unimpressed with the world. His ears flopped to the sides like 2 pieces of overcooked cabbage. He lifted a hoof with the air of a king granting a great favor. As Tomlin worked the pick around the edge of the hoof, clearing packed dirt and straw, he realized something peculiar. She was happy. Not the wild, fleeting happiness of victory or fame, but the quiet, steady kind that settled in your bones like sunshine. The stable door creaked open, and Rolf ducked inside, blinking in the dim light. "There you are," he said, eyeing the hoof pick in Tomlin's hand. "Captain's looking for volunteers to scout the northern road." Tomlin set Bertram's foot down gently. The mule sighed, as if personally offended by the interruption. "You going?" Rolf asked. Tomlin glanced around the stable, at the horses dozing in their stalls, at the neat piles of fresh hay, at old Heston humming tunelessly as he braided a new rope. Outside, the archers would be lining up shots, tightening strings, measuring distances. He picked up his pitchfork. "I've got work to do." Rolf studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." He turned to go, then paused. "You know, you're the only man I've ever met who failed his way into a better life." Tomlin smiled and tossed a forkful of hay into an empty stall. It landed perfectly. Bertram sneezed. Somewhere beyond the stable walls an owl hooted, though perhaps it was just Tomlin's imagination. Either way, he didn't look up from his work. The hay wasn't going to spread itself. Chapter 17. The Last Arrow. The quiver had gathered dust for years in the back corner of Tomlin's cottage, forgotten beneath a pile of old horse blankets and broken harnesses. He only found it because the roof had sprung a leak during the spring rains, and he needed something to sop up the water. When his fingers brushed against the familiar leather, he froze. The touch carried him back across the years, to the weight of it against his hip, the smell of bowstring wax, the terrible anticipation before each shot. For a moment, he was young again, standing on that ridge at Blackmire Fen, his hands shaking as he nocked another doomed arrow. Tomlin sat back on his heels and pulled the quiver free. It was lighter than he remembered. Most of the arrows were gone, lost, broken, or given away. But when he upended it over his palm, one single shaft tumbled out, rolling across the cottage floor before coming to rest against the leg of his chair. It was unremarkable, really. Straight fletching, decent point, a slight warp in the wood that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with failure. The last arrow, the one he'd never loosed. Tomlin picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth. Somewhere beyond the cottage walls, his horses moved lazily in their pasture, their tails flicking at flies. He stood, the arrow still in his hand, and walked to the door. The evening air was cool against his face as he stepped outside. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the first stars were just beginning to wink into existence overhead. Without thinking, Tomlin drew back his arm and threw the arrow as far as he could. It sailed through the air, spinning end over end, before vanishing into the tall grass beyond the fence. No target. No audience. No expectations. For the first time in his life, Tomlin had finally hit exactly what he'd been aiming for, nothing at all. He stood there for a long moment, watching the grass sway where the arrow had disappeared. Then he turned and went back inside, leaving the empty quiver where it lay. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, an owl hooted. Just once, as if offering its approval. Tomlin smiled and closed the door. Tomorrow would be another day of honest work, of simple tasks, of a life lived far from battlefields and expectations. The legend of the worst archer in history could belong to someone else now. He was just Tomlin, and that at last was enough. Chapter 18. The Unexpected Legacy. The children gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light as the storyteller leaned forward on his stool. "And so," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "when the great battle of Blackmire Fen was done, and the king's forces stood victorious, The arrows of Tomlin, the cursed art. He paused for dramatic effect. Not a single one had found its mark. A collective gasp rose from the children. The youngest, a girl with straw-colored hair, frowned. "But that's terrible." The storyteller chuckled, shaking his head. "Ah, but here's the strange truth of it. His arrows did more to win that battle than all the true shots of his companions combined." The tavern keeper, wiping down mugs behind the bar, rolled his eyes. He'd heard this tale 100 times, and like all the best stories, it grew taller with each telling. The enemy, the storyteller continued, became so distracted by Tomlin's impossible shots. Arrows that flew backward, that danced in midair, that untied bootlaces and stole hats from heads, that they forgot to fight. They stood gaping as those enchanted shafts performed miracles of misery, until at last their commander soared and cried. The children giggled, their imaginations painting the scene in vivid colors. The storyteller smiled, stroking his beard. And so the legend grew. Some say Tomlin's arrows still wander the world, to this day, righting wrongs, fixing mistakes, and occasionally getting hopelessly lost. In the corner of the tavern, an old stable hand snorted into his ale. He'd known Tomlin in his later years, a quiet man who smelled of hay and horses, who never spoke of battles or glory. The truth, he thought, was probably somewhere between the legend and the reality. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, or perhaps it was just an owl. The storyteller raised his cup. To Tomlin, the cursed, the blessed, the worst archer who ever lived, and the man who proved that sometimes failure is its own kind of victory. The children cheered, their voices bright with laughter. And as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, the tale took root in their hearts, not as a tragedy, not as a triumph, but as something far more rare. A story that made the world seem stranger, kinder, and infinitely more. Somewhere beyond the village, in a field long overgrown, a single arrow lay hidden in the grass. Its point rusted, its fletching frayed, but its story only just beginning.